You've made clear you do not support President Trump, but as you look at President Biden, how does he take his very left Democratic Party, his liberal party, and how does he pull them back towards, not you, but to the center, to the time of Scoop Jackson and John Kennedy? How does he execute that?
I don't know. I'm very worried about it. It's one reason I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden, unlike some of my conservative and Republican friends who have made that decision. I just philosophically can't do it. I think it's a very unhappy election prospect for real conservative Republicans who understand, as I try and lay out in the book, The Room Where It Happened, who has no real philosophy. I'm not saying because he's not a conservative, he's actually a liberal. He's nothing. He doesn't think in philosophical or policy terms. So the day after the election, if Biden wins, I think for the country, it's going to be a real test of whether a lot of this campaign rhetoric turns into action. Let's just take the Russia case as an example. For years, for decades, the Democratic Party pursued policies vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and then Russia that I thought were inadequate for the protection of American national security. I've always favored the Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan approach. Now the Democrats are tough on Russia. Well, better late than never, I suppose, is the answer. Will they be tough on Russia if Biden wins? Well, I don't think we know.
Ambassador Bolton, we can all agree that President Trump is not Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan. What we need to focus on, and my first of two questions on Russia before I go to my colleague, Jonathan Ferro, is a simple idea of the back pages of your book. The heated debate this morning is, were you involved in briefing the president or discussing with other intelligence community members, or indeed the Pentagon, about the Russians paying bounty hunters in Afghanistan to kill Marines? Now, you've stated to the Associated Press that's not the case. I need you to recapitulate that right now. Did you, late in your term at the White House, did you speak to the president about these matters?
Well, what I said to the Associated Press when that question was asked was no comment. And that's the same thing I'm going to say today. You know, we're embroiled in litigation now over whether I complied with the requirements of the pre-publication review process, which I think I did. I didn't write this book with any intention of putting classified information in it. And I don't think Donald Trump wants to suppress the book because he's worried about foreign governments reading it. He doesn't want the American people to read it. Now, look, with respect to Russia and what they're up to in Afghanistan and a range of places around the world, honestly, this current controversy I could have written about in the book if I didn't face these other difficulties. Susan Rice, the second Obama National Security Advisor, writes today in the New York Times that if she had information like that being reported in the papers, whether it was totally verified or not, she would have gone into the Oval Office to tell President Obama. So without getting into what I knew or didn't know, I just want to say I agree with Susan Rice on that point. I think that's what the National Security Advisor should do. And let me just make one more point quickly. There are not two categories of intelligence, verified over here and not verified over there. Intelligence invariably is placed along a spectrum, and the intelligence community understands this. They say they have high confidence in some, medium confidence, low confidence. People are going to have to judge, and different agencies will disagree. There's not some block of granite that you carry around to show to the president that's called verified intelligence. There's a range, and you deal with uncertainty. That's part of the job.
I looked, John Bolton, at the Susan Rice essay and also the essay by Leon Panetta. I found them extraordinary in their heat. How would you recommend that President Trump extricate himself from this now, and particularly how he dresses the military at the Pentagon?
Well, I can't offer advice on how to get out of a mess, in effect, he's created. By my count, in the last 4 or 5 days, he's told 3 different stories on whether he was briefed, whether he was told it was fake, whether it's fake news by the New York Times or a whole range of things. And his advisors are now contradicting themselves as well. How do I view that in terms of the Trump presidency? Look, it's just another day at the office. That's the way it works. Every day is a new day. Every story is a new story. What you said yesterday is interesting, but doesn't necessarily dictate what you say today. What it tells the Russians is we are in disarray and ripe for this kind of provocation, not just in Afghanistan, but in many, many other places around the world.
Ambassador, on this particular intelligence, is there any reason why intelligence like this would be put in the president's daily briefing and it wouldn't be followed up in person directly with the president himself?
Well, I don't want to comment on this specific story and its intelligence implications for the reasons I said a minute ago. I will say this, which I do say in the book. Donald Trump doesn't consume intelligence the way you expect presidents to do so. Everybody's entitled to gather information in their own personal style. Ronald Reagan had his style. George H.W. Bush had his. I'm not saying there's any one that's right or wrong. And I think the presentation of intelligence to the president has to take that style into account. So what I'm talking about here is not does the president read lengthy briefing papers? Does he get it via movies and that sort of thing? The question for Donald Trump is whether he gets it at all. And I think he's uninterested in learning. I think that facts that are inconvenient for him often don't stick, despite repeated tellings. So can he say that he was never briefed on it or that he thinks it's fake and get away with it? We'll see. Maybe he will. But this is a serious problem for the United States. You can say what you want about Joe Biden in policy terms. I think he receives, processes, and retains information. I think with Trump, it's much more questionable.
Ambassador, something that's questionable for a lot of people listening and watching this interview right now is what you chose to put in the book and what you choose not to talk about. So on Russia, no comment. But when it comes to leaning on a foreign leader to help an election coming up in November, you seem to have no problem putting that in the book. Can you walk us through the process through which you decided what to talk about and what you don't want to talk about now?
Well, look, I have a continuing obligation not to reveal classified information, so I'm not going to talk about it. I didn't talk to the press about it during my time in office, and when I wrote the manuscript, I didn't intend to start then. I went through a very lengthy, 4-month-long, page-by-page, line-by-line, pre-publication review, at the end of which the government official conducting the review concluded, as the government itself has said in court filings, that there was no classified information in the document. So that's what guides me in terms of classified versus unclassified information. In terms of substance, you know, Simon & Schuster basically said, okay, you can have 500 pages. If they had said you can have 1,000 pages, I probably could have filled that too. Some of the book reviews that I've read complain that there are too many details. I think that's the stuff of history.
Fortunate to have Ambassador Bolton with us live on Bloomberg Surveillance, both on Bloomberg Radio and on Bloomberg TV. Ambassador Bolton, this was in the Wall Street Journal. It came from you. I want to quote it for you. Trump then stunningly turned the conversation to the coming US presidential election, alluding to China's economic capability and pleading with Xi to ensure he'd win. I would print Trump's exact words, but the government's pre-publication review process has decided otherwise. Is this first-hand knowledge? Was that you in the room that overheard the President of the United States do that? Or was that also through an interpreter? Which one was it?
No, that was Donald Trump speaking in English, actually. He didn't speak in Chinese, and it wasn't interpreted back to us. The sentence that you read was what I agreed in the process of the pre-publication review to describe the exact words that the President used.
Yeah, so John, help me out with this. What did you do in the days and weeks after that? How did you follow up after you overheard the president say that?
Look, there are a lot of things that are done in an effort to keep policy on track. In that case, there were extensive negotiations underway for what turned out to be a partial trade deal. There wasn't any way to take those words back. And I believe in the records of the Chinese government 50, 100 years from now, when they're probably released, you'll see their notes as to what the president said in that meeting. There wasn't any doubt in my mind on the Chinese side. They understood what was going on. It was not the only occasion where this comment about buying agricultural products was made. You have to go on doing the job that you're assigned to do on a variety of fronts, not just how many soybeans China buys in the next year, to try and keep policy on track.
Ambassador, this is the big issue, though, that undermines pretty much everything in this book. You were an advisor to this president. You overheard him lean on a foreign leader to help him win an election. You've served several administrations. You have served your country again and again and again. Yet you chose to wait to put this information in a book instead of doing something about it at the time. And I still don't understand why. Why?
Well, I think it's very straightforward. I have done something about it. I've given it to the American people, who are the ultimate judges of Donald Trump's performance. Because of the way the Democrat advocates of impeachment in the House structured their effort, they basically made it impossible for Republicans to participate in an impeachment process that might have led to a different outcome. We have a model for that. This is not some hypothesis. In the Watergate crisis of the Nixon administration, Democrats and Republicans did work together. And while Nixon didn't go through a trial in the Senate, he did conclude he had no choice but to resign. I don't march to Nancy Pelosi's drum. I did what I thought was ultimately in the best interest of the country, because I wasn't going to participate in a completely botched process.
Ambassador, I've got to jump in. I have to jump in. Why was it in the best interest of the United States of America to wait to put this information in a book?
Thank you for allowing me to speak. The fact was that the Democratic leadership, the advocates of impeachment, had built a cliff, and they and a lot of other lemmings were heading toward it. I think it's very clear that had I participated in that because of the malpractice that they were committed, that my testimony would have made no difference. And it's not just my belief. I think this is something that, as you saw in the debate in the Senate, many Republicans bought the White House argument that even if you believed in the quid pro quo, the famous phrase that reverberated through the hearings, even if you believed on the testimony that was given that a quid pro quo had taken place, that conduct by Donald Trump did not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. That is to say, even if he did it, that's not a ground to impeach and convict him. That's a legal argument, and the way that came up was entirely based on the Democratic strategy. Go on a narrow basis, just Ukraine, and rush it through. It turned out that was not only the strategy of the advocates of impeachment, that was Donald Trump's strategy too. And what's the result of the failed strategy? Yeah. What's the result? The result is not that Donald Trump is deterred from this kind of conduct because he was impeached by the House. He is enabled to do more of this kind of conduct because he was acquitted by the Senate because of the failed impeachment strategy. So now we are left with what I think the framers of the Constitution really intended as the judge of presidential conduct, and that's the American voter.
Ambassador, you've been very critical of President Trump. You've been critical of the Democrats and how they've conducted the impeachment proceedings. What about Republican leadership? Have they done a good job offering up a check on the president?
Well, I think it's very difficult, the way these past 3.5, 4 years have evolved, for them to be as independent as I think many of them want. A lot of people who are never Trumpers say that the Republican House and Senate leadership is complicit. I don't agree with that. The fact is, nobody wants to be the subject of a Donald Trump 2 minutes hate, to use George Orwell's idea on Twitter. I think we're going to have within the Republican Party a very significant conversation after November 3rd, especially if Trump loses, which is at least a 50-50 possibility at this point, about the future of the party. That's one of the subsidiary purposes of the book in my mind. I want to make it clear that Donald Trump does not represent conservative philosophy. He does not represent the Republican Party. He is an anomaly. And I'm not going to vote for him. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not going to vote for the Republican presidential nominee because I don't think he's really true to our philosophy. I think he's true to Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone. I think a lot of people.
Ambassador, I want to break in here because the polls actually contradict that. The polls actually show that the Republican Party, by and large, has overwhelming support for President Trump. And that's the reason why Republican leadership has, more often than not, hewed to President Trump's ideas and goals. What makes you think that the Republican Party is different than what President Trump has put out there and the polls are saying?
Because public opinion polls take a limited picture based on a limited question by the pollster. Do you support Donald Trump over the Democrats? What I'm talking about is the larger issue of what the party actually believes in. And in my conversations, really across the country for an extended period of time, I don't doubt that in this debate, I think the Trump view will be rejected. I think it's an unfortunate part of our political dialogue today that it's all torqued around Donald Trump. Do you support Trump or do you oppose Trump? And there's really nothing else to discuss. That's bad for the country as a whole, and it's one of the things we need to correct. We'll have to correct it sooner or later. We may be able to correct it shortly after the November election. It may take another 4 years after that, but we are going to have to correct it.
John Bolton, two more questions about the room and about your interesting book. I love what Fareed Zakaria said about it, that the details were damning. Would any of this have happened, of Russians and bounty to the Taliban to go after Marines? Would any of this have happened if Mr. Trump had had his three generals in the same room? Was a great tipping point for the administration when those three generals walked out the door?
No, I don't think so at all. And I was in the room with him a lot of times as well. He doesn't listen well. He doesn't absorb things. You know, former Secretary of State George Shultz once said the importance of listening is always underestimated. And even Lyndon Johnson said, you know, when I'm talking, I don't learn anything. Those are points Donald Trump doesn't understand. And we all made our mistakes. I certainly made my share. I try and lay out some of them in the book. I think things maybe could have been done better. I make that argument in the book. But ultimately, Trump is Trump. That's what the problem is. This is not somebody who thinks in policy terms. So a strategy in Afghanistan, we haven't had a strategy in Afghanistan, or, by the way, with respect to Russia, or with respect to China, with respect to Iran, with respect to North Korea. The list is long.
Ambassador Bolton, one final question, if I may, and you were very kind in your comments to Susan Rice earlier in this interview. If we have a Democratic presidency, so much of this is the structure of the time of your hero, Barry Goldwater, and conservative Democratic theology of another time ago. And then we had a small matter happen in Vietnam, and the Democratic Party, many would say, has had a different foreign policy. Can Joe Biden, within the arc of his career, drag the Democrats back to some form of centrist tendency?
Well, my comment about Susan Rice will probably get both of us in trouble, so I better apologize to her in advance for that. I don't know what the fate of the Democratic Party is going to be. I don't think there is a Scoop Jackson wing of the party anymore. There isn't even a Joe Lieberman wing of the party anymore, and that's one reason why I worry about Donald Trump. If the Republican Party doesn't remain the party of a strong peace through strength, Reagan-esque policy, I don't know who's going to do it, and I think that will leave the country in jeopardy.